So my guest today is David Yeager. He's an associate professor at the University of Texas. Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'd like to start all of these out by just asking most generally, what are the research questions that guide your work?
Yeah, so I'm an adolescent development psychologist, and I want to understand how young people make the transition from childhood to adulthood successfully, and also I want to understand what stands in the way of a healthy transition to adulthood. And in particular, I want to understand the potential increases in inequalities that happen as young people transition. And so I ask a lot of questions about structures. So how do schools offer opportunities or not? But most of my questions focus on social cognitions. So where are there ambiguities in your environment that could lead young people to interpret the world one way or the other? And then how do we try to adjust beliefs or construals or the psychological perceptions of the environments so that young people can take advantage of what's available? And also, how do we mitigate the impacts of stereotypes and other sources of information that divide us and create group differences?
Okay, so jumping off of what you said in terms of maybe countering certain cultural messages that people are exposed to, we went over your paper today where there was looking at a growth mindset. And there was a sentence in there that was talking about how in America, at least, it seems like people are primarily given messages about a fixed mindset. So that struck me as interesting and something I wasn't really familiar with. So can you maybe speculate a little bit or tell us a little bit more about what do you think are those messages that people are normally exposed to that present this kind of fixed mindset?
Yeah, and so I think, just to be clear, I think both growth and fixed mindset are available broadly in society.
Okay.
But I think we're getting lots of clues about each of them. So it's a mixed message, and that's I think one reason why the intervention can be effective is because we're not giving someone a completely new idea. We're helping them pay more attention to certain types of perspectives and not another. But so much of the labor market and education and social groups is about inclusion and who gets to belong, who gets to succeed. And a big way that groups make decisions is based on assessments of ability and competence. And we get a lot of messages about whether that ability and that competence is fixed or inherent in you as a person or in your group. And that those messages can imply to people that when you struggle, you're not going to find the support that you need because people are going to have evaluated you as not smart enough. So I think group divisions in general, which give rise to essentialist thinking about ability differences, that's one source of fixed mindset beliefs. Another is social comparison. When we look around and say, why is it easier for that person versus me, right? It's easy to attribute differences in, let's say, the speed of answering a math problem or learning how to code to differences in fixed ability. And I think there are messages that are in our society that are implicit along those lines. And then there are messages that are very explicit. For instance, talking about who's smart and who's dumb, right? Who's talented and who's not.
I see. So it seems like you've gotten a lot of success in terms of countering these fixed messages from your growth intervention. And I know you've run many studies using this growth intervention, but I'll focus specifically on the one in nature that we're going to review in class today. We've spoken in this series to other people who have run kind of interventions like a belongingness intervention, and they found, granted it was many years later, that only about 8% of people even remember being in the condition treatment. I don't know what percentage might even remember in yours, but I imagine that you don't think that remembering the message itself is absolutely necessary from many months ago in order to find these effects. So is that true?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely that people remember vividly exactly what we taught them.
Okay, so I kind of want to jump off of that. So it seems like there's many steps in between, these outcomes that you're seeing and being exposed to this message that you might not even remember, many months later. So can I get you to speculate or talk about what do you think are the specific behavioral changes that occur when people are exposed to these growth mindset interventions?
Yeah, great. So the current theory is that the people get these messages and it inspires them to try out, almost as a hypothesis, some pro-learning behaviors, and that some of the time the environment affords the chance for those initial steps to become self-reinforcing, and we call that a recursive process. And so that's why we think that a time-limited message, even one that people forget, could potentially lead to long-term effects, because you might take some actions now, try a little harder, find that that seems to be effective for goal pursuit in that context. That might reinforce the beliefs. Okay, so what are the behaviors? One of the behaviors we've studied is challenge seeking. Mm-hmm. So we give people a choice of an easy math problem they could get right away without thinking, but you won't learn anything new, or a harder math problem where you might learn something new because it's beyond your expertise, but you might not look smart in front of people because you might be struggling. And what we find is that the growth mindset treatment increases the rate of challenge seeking in hypothetical measure and in a performance task that we developed.
Okay.
So challenge seeking is one. Bouncing back from failures is another one. So you struggle on a math test, you get the test back. Do you say, I did poorly because I'm dumb at math? Or do you say, I did poorly because I didn't prepare well? And so responding to a frustrating situation is another behavior that you could see reinforcing growth mindset over time.
All right. Okay, well, that's very clear. So I wanted to ask you about these growth mindset interventions, in particular in regards to groups with a stigmatized identity. So in your paper, it was particularly effective among low achieving students. But this class is very much focused on intergroup disparities. And granted, low achieving students are a group, but they're probably not the group that people particularly think about when they think about intergroup disparities. So stigmatized identities regarding race, for example, most prominently. Do you think that there's anything about these growth mindset interventions that even among lower achieving students are going to be particularly effective among people with a stigmatized identity?
Yeah, so the theoretical origin of growth mindset interventions is a stereotype threat perspective. So Josh Aronson developed the first version of growth mindset interventions in a study he did with Catherine Good. And the idea there is that he was looking at Stanford undergraduates. Black students in that study might be aware that their group could be stereotyped intellectually, and growth mindset kind of robs the stereotype of its power. So if people believe your group is lower ability, but that's not permanent, it's temporary and remediable and for a number of reasons, then the stereotype doesn't suppress your performance as much. At least that was their hypothesis. Claude Steele in his 1997 paper, A Threat in the Air, talks at the end about how growth mindset robs stereotypes of the meanest implications of their power to suppress groups. So that's a theoretical integration that I think is important and has motivated a lot of our work. In the national study, the Nature paper, I was kind of open-minded about whether the moderator would be race or social class or prior achievement. And we did a ton of piloting, and it was always just prior achievement. So it's kind of like whatever caused you to be lower performing in the past, growth mindset tends to be good for you.
Okay.
And like, it could be because of stigmatized identities. It could be something else. It also might not only be race and social class. It might be weight, or a learning difference, or looks. Like, teenagers exclude each other for lots of reasons. And so I think what the growth mindset is supposed to make challenge, difficulty not feel permanent. And there are many reasons why people might feel challenged and so on. So I think direct to student interventions should work more effectively for people that are treated in ways that stigmatizes their intellectual abilities.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be limited to racial, social class. Now, the qualification to this is Mary Murphy's work, which doesn't look at students' mindsets, but at teachers' mindsets. And they're pretty clearly, again and again, they're finding moderation by race and social class and gender. So, and that's because the intersection between teachers who are gatekeepers and holders of power and broad awareness of stereotypes about women and minorities in America.
Okay, but at least from the student's perspective, it seems like when you're lower achieving, these interventions are going to be more effective. And for some students, they can trace that lower achieving back to stereotypes about their stigmatized identity. But it doesn't have to be the case for all students.
Right. I guess the qualification is that when I've done studies in college settings, race and ethnicity and social class have been the moderators. In high school, it's almost always been prior achievement. Okay. And it's hard to know exactly what to make of that because it could be collider bias in, because college selects people on the basis of their prior achievement. So it at some level changes the meaning of the moderator.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I guess I want to zoom out a little bit and just ask, a lot of students, especially when they're just starting out, they're very enthusiastic about doing field studies, and they should be, but they're exceedingly difficult, saying someone who's never really done one, talking to someone who's done many of them. So looking back, for anyone who's just starting out and they're really drawn to field studies, do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really believe you learn a lot by getting in the field, not just about your theory, but about the importance of your work. And I think that belief in the importance of the work really sustains you when you inevitably get stuck in the muck of a project. And by importance, what I mean is when you're in the field, you often talk to the people who are going to be using the findings from your study. Mm-hmm. And just naturally you become motivated, or you see opportunities for making your work really relevant to solving social problems when you meet the users of that work. So I really recommend it for a lot of reasons. The challenge is that you're taking up people's time to be participants in your study, and they don't have to give you their time, unlike captive undergraduates or professional MTurkers / robots. And so the key thing you need to do in field research is clarify the value proposition to your partners. Mm-hmm. So what are your partners going to get out of being in your study? It's almost never the answer to your research question. They actually don't care, for the most part, what your research question is. Even the growth mindset study, they're like, sure, I already believe growth mindset. Why do I need to do this study?
Interesting.
And we're like, yeah, but eventually someone will say it doesn't work, so we need to show. Like, that sounds like your problem. Like, I'm ready to use it now. So the schools in the study weren't recruited because they cared about the experiment. They were recruited because they got a report, and then a year or two after the study, they got free professional development.
Okay.
And I ended up flying to about 60 of the schools personally and shaking hands with principals in the parking lot and all that other kind of stuff. So, but I think the key thing in field studies is add value to someone's mission. If it's a school, they're accountable for something. If you're working with social work, help them solve a problem that in their data. Whatever you're doing, if you're working with a business, add some survey questions that they care about that are tangential to your hypothesis. And then people open their doors because they're getting free consulting from you. And so that's how I build all my field studies, is I make it a partnership with a clear value proposition. And then I follow through on that.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like excellent advice, and certainly not a line of thinking that we cultivate in more lab-focused research. It's just what's the question, what's the research question? But in order to get impactful field data, you need to constantly do this negotiation to how can I convince the people who have access to these samples that this is actually worth their time. So I found that to be great advice.
It's a little tricky too when you talk about stigma and stereotypes, right? Because at some level you're taking time from people that are in marginalized groups. Mm-hmm. And if you're a member of a majority group, then it could be exploitative and like extractive. So I think it's even more important when we're when you're attuned to inequalities, that there's true value for your partners. You just don't want to mess up your hypothesis. So you don't want to like treat the control group. Okay. So you got to be creative to give people real value without messing up the study.
Continuing this line of zooming out a little bit, I'm not even sure if you identify as an intergroup relations researcher, but certainly the questions that you focus on are definitely dealing with those issues. So looking at the field of intergroup relations, is there a topic or issue that you really hope this field makes a lot of traction on in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so I, for the last decade, have been focused on helping people that are in groups that are marginalized to think about their difficulties in a way that helps them be resilient. So we kind of take a strengths-based approach. And that's great. I'm excited about that. I'm proud of what we've done. But the moderator in just about every study is whether the people in power in that setting afford the more productive and resilient way of thinking. So in the national study, the Nature paper, for instance, we treated the kids and homogeneously can change mindsets a third of a standard deviation across the country. There's no variation. The effects on grades vary quite a bit, in part based on how supportive the peers are. So if we can make kids say, hey, I would like more homework, please. But if they get made fun of in the classroom for doing that, then they're going to give up on the mindset message soon. Similarly, in a new paper, we measured teachers' mindsets in the same Nature data set, and we find that teachers' fixed mindsets crush the treatment effect. Attitudes are changed the same everywhere. The challenge-seeking task, homogeneous effects more or less, but grades effects are crushed when the teacher has a fixed mindset. So what I want people to focus on is not just how do we help individuals who are stereotyped and stigmatized to think differently, but how do we change the people in power who control access, especially when they don't have to change? Like tenured professors, for example. There's almost no way to get tenured professors to create more inclusive classrooms through mandates. Right. But they're gatekeepers for access to valuable economic opportunities for lots of people. So I think defining the challenge as in people who wield access or wield control over access to resources and access to power, and saying, how do we change them to create the kind of inclusive environments people need? That's super hard. But also, if we figure that out, then we're now manipulating the moderator from the previous intervention studies, right? We measured teachers' mindsets, now let's change teachers' mindsets. So it's a part of the cumulative story in this line of research.
That's a very interesting perspective. I think it aligns a lot with some of the other things we've talked about in class in terms of manipulating norms as a way of countering prejudice, for example. What you're saying, norms can come from your peers as well, but you're focusing on one type of norm, the norm set by maybe someone more senior in the environment. But you'll have to come back in a few years and tell us how you solved it. I really appreciate it. Just want to thank you more generally for your time, Dave. It was really nice chatting with you.
Yeah, I think your students are going to solve everything and tell me what to do.
Great point. So you guys solve it and then write.
Fabulous. Thanks, guys.